guess I will start the introductions. I'm Ellie Milanas. I'm the director of the Center for Digital Scholarship, which is not relevant to this talk necessarily. But I'm really, really happy to be the person who can introduce to you today's speaker, who is Lee Tracy, who is here because over his long and impressive career has made all sorts of really cool discoveries about a topic which, looking out at the group, I was going to say may not be familiar to all of you, but it may not be familiar to some of you, and which is classical Greek epigraphy. So with luck in an hour, we will all know a whole lot more about Greek epigraphy and the things that it teaches us about. Steve Tracy is currently a long-term, there's Cora, she's lost, long-term fellow, I think you're a long-term fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study.
Senior Research Associate.
Senior Researcher at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. Previously to this, he taught for 30 years at Ohio State University, where there's a wonderful epigraphy center. He served for a number of years as the director of the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. But, interestingly and more importantly than that, perhaps, he's an undergraduate concentrator in classics from Brown University, 1963. And I gather was identifying names this morning in the book of photographs that the classics department is putting together and helping figure out who all these people were from the past of the department. And also, for those of you who are graduate students, he studied with the faculty whose names are now associated with rows in the department. Steve has written books for the general public on Homer and Pericles, and he's published widely on epigraphic topics, notably for his work in identifying the characteristic hands of individual carvers of inscriptions. And he's written books on the subject called Athenian Lettering of the 5th Century, Athens and Macedon Attic Letter Cutters of 300 to 229 BC, and an early one whose title I especially like, The Lettering of an Athenian Mason. The idea that you can identify out of that detail is amazing. So epigraphy of various sorts is a subject that has generated great interest in a number of departments at Brown, as well as in the library. We have faculty who do Greek inscriptions, Roman inscriptions, Hebrew inscriptions, and Mayan inscriptions, and as well as two very well-developed digital corpora of ancient inscriptions, the U.S. Epigraphy Project, at whose birth Steve was present, as he was the co-author with Professor John Bodell of the paper analog antediluvian version of U.S. Epigraphy, which is now a digital project. And the Inscriptions of Israel Palestine is our other big epigraphic project, which is led by Professor Michael Sattler of Judaic Studies, which is collecting and aggregating inscriptions in Greek and Latin and Hebrew and Aramaic from the area that has been variously called Israel or Palestine. So if you want to know more about digital epigraphy, we're happy to talk to you about it. But that's not today's topic. So with great anticipation, we look forward to learning a great deal about Greek inscriptions of the classical period from a very special point of view, and then how this approach can challenge historians and their understanding of political, military, economic, cultural situation of Athens at that time. So, drama in Athens, some evidence from inscriptions. Steve Tracy.
Thank you. If it's not inappropriate, I'd like to dedicate this talk to the memory of Christian Habicht, a longtime friend and colleague at the Institute for Advanced Study.
Turn off your cell phones.
Yes, thank you. There is a handout. I hope you all have a copy. Call your attention to items 1 and 2. 1 is self-explanatory. Please read it in case you don't know this bit of information. Number 2 deals with a bit of jargon that we tend to use in Greek epigraphy, and I will be guilty of using it. When I say IG-1-3, you will see what that means. Or sometimes you say IG-1 cubed. That means the 3rd edition of the volume, of the first volume of the Attic inscriptions. IG-2-2 or 2 squared means the 2nd volume and the second edition. The third edition of the inscriptions that I'm talking about today is in preparation, but I have no idea when it will appear. In any case, it's not on the horizon at the moment. Please keep the handout handy. I will refer to it from time to time. It's a great pleasure to be back here at my alma mater, and I thank Ellie and the library for the kind invitation to present this talk. It's especially pleasant to recall my undergraduate days here and to look at those old photographs that I now realize I'm so old. I'm probably the only one who recognizes some of the people in the pictures. Though I never took a course on epigraphy, I'm pretty sure in my day that none were offered. My mentors were Professors Alan Beghold and Michael Putnam. They taught me to read the ancient text well and critically. I'm forever grateful to them. I'm sorry I had a note from Michael that he couldn't make it here today. Would have been great to see him. Over the years, I've had the good fortune to collaborate on in research on inscriptions with colleagues around the world, and of course with John Bodell, as you just heard, in his epigraphy project. We did a book, co-authored a book entitled Greek and Latin Inscriptions in the USA, a checklist, which was published by the American Academy in Rome in 1997. And I'm currently at work with Graham Oliver on the third edition of volumes 2 and 3 of the IG, the Inscriptions of Athens and Attica for the Berlin Academy. I'll be looking forward to hearing from Graham how that's going. Before I turn to my main topic, inscriptions recording Athenian dramatic performances, some background is needed, at least for some of you. I know not all. Why are inscriptions important? Because, above all, they constitute one of the most important classes of primary documents that provide evidence about the ancient Greeks and Romans. They are found in great numbers, usually in archaeological digs, and in contrast to most archaeological artifacts, because they have writing on them, they can speak directly to us. They allow us to have direct contact with the past, for they are actual writing from the ancient world. There is no long manuscript tradition, as with literary texts. You think of Homer, for instance. No long manuscript tradition that intervenes between us and the author. The inscription is the autograph. Inscriptions, therefore, have a startling immediacy. And this is one of their aspects that makes them so attractive, at least to me. As one example, we find on the so-called tribute lists of the year 443-2 BC the name of the head treasurer for that year, who was none other than Sophocles, the great dramatist. Let's have the first image. Here it is, badly worn and pitted with rain dripping down, probably from some sort of overhang where it was standing on the Acropolis. The reference is IG 1-3, number 269, line 36. You'll see it on number 3 on the handout. The stone is broken, but the reading is certain, at least to us who are used to looking at these badly worn and damaged fragments. It reads Sophocles, Kolonothen. The first letter of his name is lost, and only the first 4 letters of Kolonos, the part of Athens where he came from, are preserved. Here you can see quite clearly Kappa, Omicron, Lambda, Omicron, and the sigma was over here somewhere. That's the right-sided, the Omicron. The phi, actually, if you see a squeeze of this, the shape of the phi, the water preserved the shape of the phi. So in fact, we can see the phi, and then you can see Kappa Lambda is just the bottom of the sigma, the final sigma, and there's a bit of the bottom of the epsilon here. So we have most of his name. There's no question that this is the correct reading, and that this is the great tragedian Sophocles of Colonus, to come across his name on a stone inscribed when he was at the height of his powers. In 443, he was in his early 50s and had recently seen his Ajax performed. To see his name here, even in its worn and broken state, gives me an almost childlike feeling of close contact with someone from the past. We can, after all, be pretty certain that he looked at this very stone and saw his name inscribed at some point. But to repeat, inscriptions survive in great numbers. They provide new information, new facts about almost every aspect of the ancient world. To again draw a contrast with the study of literary texts, it is probable that scholars over the centuries have extracted from, say, the text of Thucydides, all of the factual information there is to be had. New interpretations will always be needed. Each generation needs to interpret anew. This is something some of our politicians should recognize. But new facts, very unlikely. Each inscription, by contrast, no matter how small, usually provides something new, even if only the name of a new person. Thus, cumulatively, they throw light, however narrowly focused, on almost every aspect of the ancient world. Now, in contrast to what is the usual case, which I've just described, namely inscriptions that offer just minor bits of new information, I offer two examples of inscriptions that have made major contributions to our knowledge of Athenian history. We know much about the Delian League, the defensive alliance that the Athenians and their allies created against the Persians in the aftermath of the Persian attacks at Marathon of the year 490 and at Salamis 10 years later. The ancient authors, particularly Thucydides, tell us much about it and about Aristides, called the Just, setting the first assessments known as tribute from the member states of the League. We also learn from them of the shift of the treasury of the League, most probably in the year 454 from Delos to Athens for safety, or so they said. That move signaled that the League had now become, in fact, the Athenian Empire. But these sources give us almost no details about the makeup of the alliance. That is, the crucial questions, who paid and how much. Let's have the next slide, please. It is the great series of fragments of inscriptions known as the tribute list, numbers 259 to 290 and IG 13, that provide the names of the contributors and the amounts they paid. This is a photograph of the so-called lapis primus, or first stone, on which were inscribed the lists of contributors of the first 15 years. Before I go further, Sophocles' name occurs right about here on this fragment, right about there. So his name wasn't way up at the top. This thing is 4 meters, somewhat over 4 meters tall, somewhat over 12 feet high. But surely it could be read, though not by someone as nearsighted as I am now. It is composed of 184 fragments. We learn from these inscriptions that the Athenians collected total contributions of around 350 talents a year from the member states. Let's have the next image, please. The contributing states, seen here with these black dots, numbered each year about 160 to 170 and came from all over the Aegean, from Rhodes in the south to Thassos in the north, from Thrace, from all along the coast of Asia Minor, and the regions around the Hellespont. We would know none of these details if we did not have the inscribed lists. This next example will illustrate how just 2 lines from a very worn and fragmentary inscription, IG 222318, lines 10 to 11, this is number 4 on the handout, can provide, can provide really important information. Next image, please. And this one is hard to read. but I'll try to show you what you need to see. This inscription records the winners of choral competitions at the Dionysia. This entry for tragedy reads simply, Pericles Kolar ekore. Pericles of Kolargos was Choregos, that is, he produced it, he paid for the production. And you can see here quite clearly chi, omicron, lambda, alpha, rho. The rest of it's much harder to read. This was the kappa of his name here, kappa lambda. And the next line reads, Aeschylus edidaska. Aeschylus wrote and directed it. Again, if you're adept at reading these things and have looked at them for a long time, alpha, iota, sigma, chi, upsilon, it's actually quite clear to anyone who's experienced in looking at these things. I know it'll look like gobbledygook to all of you, but it is clear, believe me. The year is not preserved on this inscription. Fortunately, we learn from the Scholia to Aeschylus's play, The Persians, that 473-2 was the year that it was first presented. So we get the date from the Scholia. The Scholia do not mention Pericles as producer. Only the inscription tells us that. So Pericles underwrote the production of the Persians. What are we to make of this? What do we know about the play? It is the earliest tragedy that we have, and it is unique among surviving tragedies in taking as its subject an historical event, namely the defeat of the Persians in the sea battle at Salamis. It was put on in the Theater of Dionysus on the south slope of the Acropolis in the year 472, just 8 years after the battle. The debris from the Persian destruction of the sacred buildings on the Acropolis and round about would have been very visible to that first audience as they sat watching. In the play, the Greeks, primarily the Athenians, are portrayed as the instrument, the right hand of the gods, used to punish the hubris of the Persians for their depredations. This was, I'm sure, for that audience, and still is, heady, patriotic stuff, a sure crowd pleaser. While no Athenian is mentioned in the text, it's a victory of the whole people. Details in the play reminded the audience of Themistocles, the man most responsible for the victory. Indeed, during the 480s, Themistocles had worked hard to build up the Athenian naval power, and it was he who devised the brilliantly successful strategy at Salamis of engaging the numerically superior Persian fleet in the Narrows. Pericles was born about 495. So in 472, he's a pretty young guy, about 23. His father had just died. Themistocles at that time was the avowed leader of the common people, those who manned and maintained the triremes. At that time, he was under political attack by the aristocratic faction. In reminding the audience of Themistocles' leadership in the Persian Wars, the youthful Pericles was taking a clear political stand with the people and against the landed aristocrats from whom he came. He must have been looked on as something of a traitor. He could not have made his democratic leanings more clear, it seems to me, even at this early stage in his career. Before the discovery of this inscription, even though he was arguably the greatest leader that the Athenians produced, we really had no information about his activities as a young man. In fact, Plutarch, the only ancient biographer, says nothing about his youth except some vague comments about teachers, and describes his first political act as his opposition to his rival Cimon in the 460s, quite a bit later than this time, 10 years or so later. Now, to go back to inscriptions. Another important fact to keep in mind about inscriptions, most are very fragmentary. The reason for this is that inscribed stones were handy for building material. They were good size to break up and put in walls and so on. And so they were often broken up for reuse. Many probably also ended up in the lime kilns to make cement. Inscriptions that survive whole are thus rather rare. I mean, the ones you study in your history books are the few that do survive rare, but they are really exceptional. Most often we deal with rather small fragments that have nothing in their text that enable them to be dated. All we have is the lettering preserved on their surface. Thus, by default, they must be dated by the style of their lettering. And this is really a tricky business. People trust these dates far more than they should. Most inscriptions are dated by general letter style and be warned 100 years plus or minus. No, anyone who claims to date more accurately, and as much as I loved and respected David Lewis, he once told me he could date any inscription of the 5th century to a decade. And I looked at him, I was rather young then, and I said, only God can do that. And he had the grace to laugh. Yet, dating inscriptions accurately is vitally important. For, as is true of all archaeological artifacts, the more accurately we can date them, the more valuable they are as evidence. I'm going to turn to my own work, and I apologize, but this is what I was asked to talk about, so I'll duly do it. Most of my research on Greek inscriptions is focused on identifying hands and collecting the work of individual ancient inscribers. Why would anyone want to do this? Sometimes I've asked myself that. Simply stated, the study of hands provides a powerful means of dating. If you can bring together the stones cut by one man, clearly all will be dated by his working career, and some may actually go together. That is, be separate fragments of the same inscription. But everyone had regarded identifying the work of individual scribers as impossible. They assumed that the medium, hammer and chisel on marble, severely limited if it was not absolutely inimical to individual idiosyncrasy. I have shown that it is possible not only to treat the lettering on inscribed stones as a type of handwriting, but that it is also possible to identify reliably the work of individual cutters. In fact, I have published a series of books collecting the work of Athenian inscribers of the 5th century through the early 1st centuries BC. As a result of this work, I have put numerous fragments back together and redated, narrowed, or confirmed the dates of a great many previously undated or insecurely dated fragments. Thus, I think it is no exaggeration to say that I have helped to establish an improved chronological framework for the study of Athenian history. The study of epigraphical hands, in short, has provided a powerful means for dating many fragments. Now I call your attention to number 5 on the handout. I'm going to refer to these inscriptions sometimes, usually by their number. So I've given you what they are so that you can consult them if you need to. I'll either say 2 and a number or just sometimes a number. As one example of what the study can accomplish, I asked you to consider the lettering on the following fragments. Let's have the next image. Before continuing, studying a hand and learning it is a very long process. I really can, with many of these people, recognize their writing instantaneously just the way you would the writing of a close relative. I can't get you to that stage today. It's hard enough to get myself to that stage sometimes. What I can do and what I will do is try to point out a few peculiarities in this writing and then show them to you on other fragments and invite you to decide for yourself whether you think they're the same or not. It's rather subjective, I admit it, and there's I don't know of any way around it. This, in any case, is IG22, 2320. It records performances of tragedy at the Dionysia. It's quite a large fragment, and thankfully much of the lettering is well preserved. You can see here. The letter strokes are thin and sharply cut. The spacing is even, and while there is a lot of variation in the placement of strokes, the writing, if not neatly made, is easy to read. Long strokes often curve a bit, especially the slanting strokes of mu and alpha, and the second vertical of nu. Epsilon is made with horizontal strokes of different lengths. You can see them here almost anywhere. There are lots of epsilons here. You'll see them. The central one is the shortest. The bottom one is often the longest. However, occasionally and unusually, the longest is the top stroke. There's no good example here, but this is not a picture of the whole. The ends of the strokes have small serif-like thickenings. You can see them quite clearly there. Mu is very wide and not symmetrical. In fact, the right half is often larger. Let me see if I can find a good example quickly.
That middle square has a good one, Steve.
Where are we?
There.
There, yeah, this is a good example, yeah. He doesn't do it all the time, but it's a habit that he has. One of the things about identifying a hand is you're not only looking for peculiarities, but looking for how much variation he allows himself. They didn't have stencils, they cut freehand, and so you can never expect complete uniformity from one letter to the next. Like mu, nu too is usually quite a wide letter, and the second vertical can be taller, and this is fairly unusual. Verticals that as tall or taller curve outward some, as here. In this period, nus still were made often with the second vertical shorter, so this is a small idiosyncrasy of his. Omicron is often quite small and round. It is placed up a bit in the letter space, and you can see good examples there. P is a wide letter. The second vertical is usually shorter and ends in a thickening. One here. There. And he's almost quite consistent about that. Upsilon has the shape Y. It is composed of 3 strokes. The vertical is half the height of the letter or a bit more. The left side of the large surmounting V is often longer and sometimes and almost always more vertical than the right. There and here. Okay, let's have the next image. Now, let us look carefully at the writing on 3 other fragments. The first is on the right here, 2323A. There's nu with the tall, the 2 P's with the thickenings. There must be a mu somewhere which has a bigger, here it is. Bigger right side, the small omicrons, and there is somewhere here an epsilon with a longer top stroke. First line, yeah, this one is and that's really quite unusual. It's not that much longer, but it's definitely longer. And I think, look at those side by side. In my opinion, they're the same writing, but now let's look at the next example. This is Agra inventory number 7151. Is the P, nu with the long stroke, mu with the wider right side, small omicron. The upsilons are quite characteristic. The thickenings at the end of the epsilons. Placed side by side, it is quite easy, I think, to see that the writing is the same. But nobody really had seen it. Now the third fragment, let's have the next image please, is 2321, is more difficult because it's a rather small fragment with just a few letters. But the curving long strokes, epsilon with the long top horizontal, there it is clearly in the thickenings. P with the thickening, rather wide and thickening at the bottom. Nu with a curving second vertical. Here. And the smallish omicrons are all very characteristic. And to my eyes, this is unmistakably the same hand. But you'd have to study the writing for a long time to pick it up. But once I knew the hand, I recognized it immediately. Now, in addition to the same writing, all these fragments have the same size lettering and the same rather small interlinear spacing, and all are on gray marble. It seems fairly clear that they are all parts of the same inscription, yet they've always been published and treated as separate, though related inscriptions under the general rubric of didascalia, a technical term meaning records of dramatic performances. Let's have the next image. This inscriber, let us call him the Didascalia inscriber, also has the habit of using double dots frequently to mark abbreviated words and short horizontals to separate some entries. You can see the double dots, the Hipa, or Hippocrinator, the actor, so-and-so acted it, and double horizontal lines surrounding the Hippocrates, the winning actor, here and here. Pretty consistent about that. This combination of dots and short horizontals characterizes only his work. And except for these fragments that I've just been showing you, it does not appear in any of the other fairly numerous dramatic festival inscriptions. There is, very interesting, a fifth inscription, IG 222319, that has been published as part of the Didascalia. The stone no longer survives, and we know it only from a copy made by Formont in the 18th century. His notebook is in the Louvre. It is most notable that these dots and lines appear on Formont's transcription of 2319. Let's have the next slide, please. And let's close up of this now, the next image. Here you can see the straight lines around Hippo, the double dots after Hippa, and so on. From the appearance of this peculiarity, is quite certain that this fragment too was the work of the Didascalia inscriber. These then are not parts of four separate inscriptions, but one large one, inscribed all at one time by one man. It listed from the beginning down to about the year 280 all the dramatic performances of tragedy and comedy presented at the Linnaea and at the city Dionysia, the two major festivals of Athens that featured dramatic performances. It was a massive inscribing project, totaling some 8,850 lines. See number 6 on the handout for a summary. It's the largest of these inscriptions by far. Sadly, only small bits survive. I've shown you all of them. We have in fact, on these fragments I've just shown you, parts of just 124 lines, something less than 1% of the whole. Could this really be the work of one man? As my eye tells me it is, and must have been. The writing on all the fragments is regular and uniformly spaced. 10 lines of text require 10 centimeters of vertical space. Each line and interline occupy 1 centimeter. Columns, together with their interspaces, have a maximum width of about 17 centimeters. The roughly 8,850 lines of text required for these 4 records could be accommodated in 44¼ columns of text if each column had 200 lines. The columns would then be at a minimum 2 meters high, and the wall wide enough for them would have had to have been at least 7½ meters long. These dimensions are certainly feasible, either for a freestanding wall or the cellar wall of a temple. In fact, we know a small temple on the south slope, the cellar walls of which were 10 meters or slightly more long. How long would it take to inscribe 8,850 lines of text? The mind boggles to think about inscribing that many letters. We don't know, but an estimate appears possible. The lines are relatively short, most between 15 and 20 letters long, few longer than 20 letters. With a period around 100 BC, it has been estimated that the cutter could inscribe slightly more than 400 letters a day. If this rate of work is anywhere near the mark, then our cutter inscribed approximately 20 to 27 lines a day, perhaps a bit more. At a rate of 30 lines a day, it would require 295 working days to inscribe this many lines. And at a rate of 26 lines a day, 340 working days. So in fact, it is entirely possible for one man to have inscribed the whole in the space of a single year, and probably contracts were for a year. Can the spatial relationship of these fragments to one another be reconstructed? Yes, in a rough way. 2320 preserves the right side with anathyrosis. I'm sorry for this technical term. This is a term for cutting back the side of a block so it will butt up smoothly against another block. And it shows that this particular block had another block next to it. And 2323A has its original back and was almost 24 centimeters thick. It's a good thick block. So these 2 fragments reveal that we are, in fact, dealing with blocks of a wall or a building. The other fragments are broken all around, fairly small, and none of them can go with any of the others. So other than content, there's not a lot to go on in placing them. Let's have the next image, please. I apologize for this really rough drawing that is not to scale at all, but it'll help you see what I'm saying. 2320 records tragic performances at the city Dionysia for the years 342-1 to 340-39. 2323A preserves performances of comedy at the city Dionysia for the year 312-11. Since the performances of tragedies at the Dionysia started about 15 years before those of comedy, it appears likely that tragedies at the Dionysia were listed, before comedies. So 2323A came in the wall some distance to the right of 2320. Moreover, since dramatic performances at the city of Dionysia were older than those at the Linnea, it likewise seems probable that they came first, that is, to the left of the fragments that recorded performances at the Linnea. 2319, column 1, lists parts of the comic performances at the Linnea for the years 286-5 and 285-4. Since we know this was inscribed about 280, notice how close to the end we are of this listing for comedy. While column 2 lists tragic performances at the same festival for the 5th century, for the years 420-19 to 418-17. It thus crucially gives us the sequence of listing for the Linnea, with comedy preceding tragedy. More significantly, we have here the final column of the listings for comedy and the first for those of tragedy. This enables a calculation of the height of the columns as slightly more than 2 meters. In fact, we can show that that was about the height of the columns. The small fragment, 2321, which probably lists comedies at the Linnea of the mid-4th century, will come on the wall before 2319, as you see it there, some distance to its left. 7151 lists tragedies at the Linnaea for the years 365-4 to 363-2. Therefore, it came in the monument some distance to the right of 2319. Note that we have, in fact, a scattered random sampling of fragments from this huge inscription. That they are all in the same writing surely suggests, if it does not absolutely prove, that the huge number of missing parts of this inscription were all inscribed by the same man. Thus we know, as a result of the study of the hand, that there was one very large inscription that recorded performances of tragedies and comedies at the city Dionysia and at the Linnaea from the beginning down to about the year 280, and that it was inscribed all at the same time by one inscriber. Even more remarkable is that another large inscription, IG 222325, was created at this same time. It lists in chronological order, and I don't have time to talk about it here, and it's hugely fragmentary, even more than this. It lists in chronological order for the two festivals the names of the victors and the number of their victories. There are separate lists for victorious tragic poets, tragic actors, comic poets, and comic actors. That is 4 lists for the Dionysia and 4 for the Linnaea. These lists, too, were all inscribed at one time by one man, but not the same man who inscribed the Didascaliae. Thus, around the year 280, there was an extraordinary effort by the Athenians to memorialize the city's theatrical productions by creating these 2 inscriptions that recorded on stone for all to see the distinguished history of dramatic performances at Athens. What was the motivation? Well, this is always a hard question. Who knows? But I'll try to suggest what I think might have been behind it. Roughly half a century earlier, something similar, if grander, had occurred. Following the humiliating defeat by the Macedonians at the Battle of Chaeronea in the summer of 338 BC, Athens' leaders, particularly a man named Lycurgus, sought to reassert civic pride. As one of the chief means to accomplish this, they turned to the theater, and particularly to Athens' clear preeminence in tragedy. They rebuilt the theater of Dionysus in stone, erected statues of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides in it, and had official copies of the plays made and archived. It was also in these years that Aristotle and his school produced 3 works entitled Nikae Dionysiakai, Victories at the Dionysia, Peri Tragodon, on tragedy, and Didascaliae, lists of dramatic performances. Only the titles survive, but they were designed, it seems, to preserve an accurate record of dramatic performances from the beginning to Aristotle's time. We may imagine that these were the inspiration, and perhaps even the source, for the inscriptions we are here considering. Similarly, 50 years later, in the 280s, the Athenians were celebrating the liberation of their city from the domination of a Macedonian king, King Demetrius Poliorcetes, whom they had ousted in the year 287. These great inscriptions recording the proud history of their theater then were surely one way of flexing their cultural muscles in an effort to reassert the prestige of the city. General civic pride, then, was an important motivational force. But who was responsible? Can we see the agency of a person or particular group? Again, this is a hard question, and I'm not sure we can really answer it, but I'm going to take a shot at suggesting what I think, who may have been responsible. There is some pertinent evidence that comes from Delphi. Very close to the date of the creation of these 2 very large inscribed projects is a decree of the Amphictyonic Council, the governing body that controlled the very influential religious center of Apollo at Delphi. This decree, known in two copies, one from Delphi, and if you want the numbers, I'll give them to you later, and one from Athens, dates to the year 277 BC, and grants elaborate privileges to the Athenian Actors Guild, the so-called Guild of Dionysiac Artists. This is strikingly the first mention we have of that guild, 277 BC. The members of the guild are awarded by this decree freedom from taxation. Think of it. An exemption from military service, and their persons are declared inviolable. The decree goes on to promise harsh penalties, or threaten harsh penalties, to any person, city who violates these privileges. This amounted to a free pass for the Athenian actors and musicians to ply their trade at festivals throughout the Greek world. This was big business at the time. Very popular. Most importantly, the existence of this decree shows, I think, that the Athenian Guild by the year 277 had very significant political clout. Indeed, enough to persuade the Amphictyonic Council at Delphi to grant them these extraordinary privileges. Privileges that surely put them at an advantage over rival guilds, particularly the Egyptian and Isthmian Nemean guilds. This being the case, it is not unlikely, likewise, that they had the political influence at home necessary to bring about the inscribing of these inscriptions that I've been talking about. I think it is likely that they were the moving force behind the project. But of course, there's always a problem in the study of the ancient world. The generally accepted opinion is that the Athenian Guild, the Egyptian Guild, the Isthmian Nemean Guild, and others did not come into being until after 300 BC. I wonder, at least in the case of the Athenian Guild, if this can be correct. I really don't think it can. Tragedy, after all, developed first in Attica in the 6th century. Thespis' first victory at the Dionysia dated to around the year 535. And actors must have been organized in some way already in the 5th century. No doubt, too, the activities of Lycurgus and of Aristotle, that I was talking about a minute ago, in reviving theatrical performances and documenting their history after Chaeronea, that is, in the last decades of the 4th century, significantly bolstered the standing of the actors and musicians. It seems likely, in fact, that the Athenian Guild of Dionysiac Artists formally came into being at this time, in the late 4th century. That is, shortly after Chaeronea, if not earlier. However, all we can really say for certain is that the Athenian Guild had reached a very high level of political organization and influence, not only in Athens, but outside of it, by the year 277. Thank you very much. I think I've made the time.
I know that there are people who have to go for classes and all that, but while they speak out carefully, we have time for some questions. Joanna.
Yes.
Hi, Professor Casey. Thank you very much for this. I was wondering what you make of the Didascalic inscription, the Didascalii, including the second and third place contestants.
Yeah.
That's something unusual. It's not the case in 2318 in the FOSS.
Right, no, it's not.
And it's unusual to record
Yeah.
second place, pairs, right? So do you think that?
I think it was an attempt to spread the honors and impress. I do think these had a propaganda purpose, and I think it was to make them as big and as impressive as possible, rather like the tribute list in the 5th century. How do you suppose it looked to a visitor to come in and see that great 12-foot high, 12-foot high, 4-meter high stele just covered with lists of people who were paying taxes to Athens? As I call it, tribute. And I think this the same way. I really think this was somewhere very near the Theater of Dionysus. I think it may have been on that little temple of Dionysus, because one of the later blocks is clearly the North Estate block. And I think they did continue the list down into about the mid, around 150, I guess, 170.
Just to follow up quickly on that, I mean,
Yeah.
one thing that I've always wondered is that if you're, I mean, the Athenian theater industry is so cosmopolitan and international, you know,
Right.
already in the fifth century, but certainly, you know, a fortiori by
Right.
this point. And I wonder if it might not also have to do with the fact that the big three, you know, so Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were already sort of canonized, didn't come in first all that often.
Right, that's
So
right.
if you wanted to go to Athens and breathe in the air of Euripides,
Right, right, yeah.
that you would have, you get to see his name if you include
Yeah,
second and
yeah,
third place
yeah.
more often.
That's right.
That's what
And
I
even
was
first place more than the others.
Exactly. The second and the third were great too.
Yeah, yes,
So
yeah.
we are fantastic.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, a bit like, you know, today, those of us who like Shakespeare going to London, going to the Globe, even though it isn't quite the same theater. For these people, it was the same theater, rebuilt in stone, but the same place, same location. The buildings, many of them went back to the time of the Great Tragedians. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about dating the inscription. It seemed maybe that the date mostly comes from where they sort of stop listing the
Right,
plays.
right,
How
that's
how
right.
sure can you be that that's where the list stopped? Just kind of looking at the fragments.
Looking at both lists, they both, done by different men, they both end very close to, I think the last comic poet listed on 2325 dates to 282. And, I mean, I can't prove it, obviously, but I think you've hit on a very good point. It's an educated guess. But fitting in with other things, the proximity to the ouster of Poliorcetes, the decree from Delphi, it looks like, and we know that in this period, John Maher has written a book on Athenian statuary, and there was at the same time, something I couldn't get into in the talk, the putting up at this time statues of Demosthenes and some of the great heroes, all in the 280s, right around exactly the same time. So it looks like there was an effort to mimic what Lycurgus and his colleagues had done a generation earlier, 50 years earlier. So, thank you, that's an excellent question. I admit it's 280s a guess, but I think a good one.
I'll step forward so I don't have to shout. Have you, having identified some of these carvers, have you found inscriptions from other areas or topics that they also worked on? Because if this was a professional carver, you would think that they wouldn't just take commissions from this one temple or
Right.
whatnot. Have you been able to find that they would inscribe things in other places or in other disciplines?
I've looked. In this case, I have not found this man's hand in any other inscription, I'm sorry to say. I've looked rather thoroughly, hoping to find it. The cutters that I have studied, rather numerous, those who cut a lot of inscriptions, and most of them did it, they didn't die prematurely. This is the way they made their living. They were experts. Not just anyone could come along and be handed a text of several thousand letters and be able to say it'll go on that stone and get it down. You know, these guys were like, we don't do typesetting anymore because it's all done by computer, but good typesetters, that was a tremendously valuable skill, to be able to do quickly and accurately on newspapers. And I think these guys were very, very proficient professionals who did a lot of inscriptions. They tended to work for any and everyone who needed a long text inscribed, whether it was the state or some private group like the Dionysiac artists. I had at Delphi a guy who cut a lot of inscriptions for the Pythias, but he worked in Athens on Ephebic decrees. He He did decrees for the state for listing the officers, the Brittany decrees, and they don't specialize. What they do is they don't cut gravestones. Anybody who in Athens and Attica who was around Marble much and knew how to handle a chisel, hammer and chisel, could cut a gravestone. That was boring work for these guys. Anybody could do that, but not anyone could cut one of these long decrees. I mean, these things, the letters are about this high. They're under a centimeter, and the reason they can't cut all that many letters per day is it's not physically tiring, but it's really tiring on the eyes. It's really close work. If you don't have the right situation, I know of a case where a man inscribed on a wall, and that's probably what this inscription is. Working outside, doing that on a wall is really hard work. Hard on the eyes and hard physically. Maybe I'm thinking that being able to do it in 1 year is a bit optimistic, but he certainly did it in a finite amount of time.
We have a last question, John?
Yeah, John.
Thanks very much, Steve, and forgive me if you've already explained part of this that I may have missed, but I think the second part of my two-part question you didn't address. Looking at the reconstruction you give us right here, and this is the part where I may have missed something, in which case I apologize, I'm assuming that it's fragment 2319 that lets you hypothesize that the comedies of the Linnea were listed before the tragedies?
Right. Also in the known fact that the comedies at the Linnea were older than the tragedies.
Yes.
They started about 25 years. I don't remember the exact dates, but...
My second question really follows on what you were just answering nicely to the previous question about the composition of this massive document. Do you think, given that it's a single carver, when he was commissioned, it was left to him to determine what height and length it would be, or was that already preset, and his assignment, as it were, would be to figure out how many columns and width to get X amount of...
Yeah. Boy, that's... I think he was told what wall to put it on.
Yeah, and then had to work it out.
And then had to work it out, yeah. And that must have been these are actually 44 columns. I told you this isn't to scale, but and these fragments are shown much bigger than they would be if I'd done it to scale. And another answer to that question about the 280 is the last two comedies here on 285 and 284, I think. And if you then come down, and if you figure out how many lines up to go to when tragedy started in this column, it pretty well works out. I mean, it's fairly, there's not much leeway, let's put it that way, with that end date being about 280.
Thank you.
I don't know if I answered.
Yes, you did, thank you.
So I'm going to say that we should applaud while we still have a chance before people leave for classes.
Thank you all for
Thank you very
coming.
much, and maybe we'll mill around a little afterwards.
Thank you.